So we've got two speakers who are going to talk about what's global about global higher education and why does it matter. I don't probably need to introduce either, but I'm going to do it anyway. So first we've got Bob Jessop. He's professor of sociology at Lancaster University and has worked extensively on state theory and published many books in that area. He works on issues surrounding the knowledge economy and cultural political economy, as well as on governance failure, and the relationship between the shape or the changes in the role and shape of states and their function. Very shortly, paraphrasing. Roger Dale is professor of education at the University of Bristol. Worked before at Auckland, where he started to work on the response of education system to the challenges globalization raises in Canada, New Zealand, Scotland, and Singapore. Building on that, he's now looking at the relation between the EU and education policies, or more generally, EU and education policies. So I welcome both our speakers, and both are going to talk about 30-35 minutes. If you have got questions, hold back. There's going to be a Q&A session afterwards. Okay, thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Globalization and why does it matter? I'm going to begin with an anecdote. I was on a plane to Columbus, Ohio, I'm not quite sure why. Sitting next to me was a very famous German sociologist, Niklas Luhmann. By chance, I saw he was reading the papers from the conference, and I turned to him and said, "I'm Bob Jessop, I'm a state theorist." He said, "I'm Niklas Luhmann, the state doesn't exist." And the point of that anecdote is starting with what's global about global higher education and why does it matter, presupposes that globalization exists. If I was sitting next to Simon Marginson on a plane and he turned to me and said, "And I'm interested in globalization," I might be tempted to say, "And globalization doesn't exist." The point being that by defining a particular perspective, you exclude other perspectives. So taking the optic globalization excludes other ways of thinking about the socio-spatiality of higher education and research. Also framing it in terms of what's global about global higher education presupposes that we can treat higher education as something homogeneous. I think there are at least two different systems at work, or codes at work, in higher education. One is education, which has the code credentialization, qualified, not qualified, and the other system functioning inside higher education is scientific research, which is much more concerned with scientific protocols. And we all know, as teachers, we often tell our students something we know not to be true, because pedagogically you have to start somewhere, and then you spend the rest of your life telling them what you taught you the year before is not valid knowledge. And in the same way, with science as process, we're continually moving on as well. So I'm raising a question mark about whether globalization is the right entry point, and I'm trying to deconstruct the meaning of higher education, particularly as it can mean institutions or organizations or a system. Where's my entry point? Everybody's declared their discipline. I think I could say I'm a geographically informed political economist who works in a pre-disciplinary or transdisciplinary or post-disciplinary way. My entry point is going to be primarily capitalism, but not just capitalism in general, but academic capitalism. And I think many of us are living the impact of academic capitalism. I want to see to what extent that can be understood in terms of globalization or something else. Moving on quickly, and I will be sending to Janja and to Paul the PowerPoint. I probably won't get all the way through, so what I miss is available to you You can put that into context by reading other things. So I'm going to start with globalization as a chaotic concept, what we don't see by starting with globalization. And then going to deal with its complexities, and I'm going to deal with, and it's about time too, because there's a tendency to see globalization in socio-spatial terms, to ignore the fact it also changes temporalities in a variety of different ways. And a large part of what we're experiencing in higher education at the moment has more to do with the changing temporalities as it does with the changing spatialities of higher education and research. Then, following Niklas Luhmann, you see, he irritated me and I learned something from him. I'm going to put higher education and world society into dialogue together, and then shift perspective to take a perspective of knowledge-based economy, increasing competitiveness, entrepreneurship, and so forth. And if there's time, I'm going to end up with an alternative perspective on globalization and higher education, which I call variegated academic capitalism. But what you could see something with one perspective, you can't see other things with it. So I'm not saying this is the answer. This is an alternative perspective from those we've received so far. So let me start with the ABC of globalization, where, as we know, A is for alibi. Politicians, we're hearing it at the moment in relation to Brexit, in relation to New Labour and so forth. It's an alibi for politicians and other leading figures. Globalization made me do it. And wanting to become a globally significant university, globalization made me do it. Lots of changes in higher education are justified in the name of globalization made me do it, when the actual motives, strategies, incentives come from somewhere entirely different. It also stands for a buzzword, and this is one of the reasons I'm always suspicious about have paper, will travel. Whatever I work on plus globalization is a ticket into any conference you care to mention. And I'm pretty sure that if there was a conference on regionalization, Simon Marginson could reinvent himself and talk about higher education and regionalization, or higher education and triadization, or Europeanization, and so forth. So we have to be careful that it doesn't just become a buzzword. It provides an interesting point of intersection, communication. We're all here for a conference on globalization and higher education. It's already clear we understand different things by it, and if we're not careful, it just becomes a meaningless buzz word. And then C is catch-all concept, and again, there's a risk in starting with globalization. One of my favorite questions for undergraduates is social scientists never solve problems, they get bored with them. And we exhaust a particular topic, we move on, and then we rediscover it. And I heard this morning about imperialism. Imperialism might be an interesting alternative perspective on higher education. So what is imperial about higher education rather than what is global about higher education might cause rather different sets of inquiries to occur. So some complexities of globalization. In terms of alibi, as I've already pointed, people talk about globalization if it's a single mechanism, a single process. It isn't. It's doesn't have not a single mechanism, it doesn't have uniform effects, it doesn't culminate in a fully integrated global society, global state, global higher education system, and so forth. If we think about globalization seriously, it's multicentric, it emerges and works through many sites, many centers. It's multi-scalar, it works at many different scales. The only opposite I've heard to globalization so far today are local versus global, and some references to regional, but there are many more scales, sites, places, positionalities, spatialities at work. It's multi-temporal, it operates over many time horizons. People think about finance as super speedy, but global warming may be accelerating, but it's still glacial, as John Urry used to say. It's multi-rhythmic, there are many different rhythms and temporalities involved. It's multi-form, it takes many forms. Multi-agential, it's not just capital. It's not just the state, it's not just university leaders or students, but many other agencies involved as well, and it's multi-causal. So when we say that something is occurring because of globalization, we're simply saying, I don't know why it's occurring, unless we actually give a much more precise description and explanation of what's at stake. And it's even more complicated than that, because what in some perspectives might make sense to talk about as globalization could also be described as internationalization, as regionalization, glocalization, glurbanization, a term that Neiling Sum and I introduced, rescaling, bilateralism, global city formation. But all of those also contribute to globalization. 3 or 4 processes of regionalization, when the regions then interrelate, leads on to globalization. And one response to globalization is regionalization. So in fact, I think there's a can of worms to be opened in terms of globalization and higher education. Now, let's talk about the spatiality, because globalization's been primarily discussed in this forum in terms of internationalization. It's not so clear what globalization means. But if we think about space, there are many ways of thinking about spatiality, and if there are many ways of thinking about spatiality, there are many ways of thinking about what's global, about the global university. Together with some geographers, I've been working on something we call the TPSN scheme. The economic geographers here will know about that. Territory, place, scale, network. And we can think about space as an umbrella term, territory as the territorialization of political power, what states do, which is to set territorial frontiers and govern inside that territory. We have scale, which isn't at all the same as territory, and then we can have dominant, nodal, subaltern scales, tangled hierarchies of scales, and so forth. There's place or locale and networks, and if we think of that in terms of higher education, we have, as the Vice-Chancellor put it this morning, in terms of space as an umbrella concept, we have the global university is globally significant, with global horizons of calculation or action and global strategies to make a global impact. Interesting set of aspirations, but when you then say, what does it mean to be global, it's just an umbrella term. It's a horizon of action and calculation. So is the global university, in terms of TPSN, is the global university one that is free from any given state control, not controlled or regulated by a nation state, a local state, the European Union, but free of all territorial restrictions? Is it border crossing in terms of recruitment, curriculum, research, and so forth? We think in terms of place, is a global university one that is globally distributed, either because it's got campuses in many continents, in many global cities or elsewhere, or because it's formed international partnerships and alliances and has a presence in many different places. I understand that Lancaster University is now developing flying faculty so that we can fly off to China and teach on 4+0 contracts there. Does it develop a global identity rather than a local identity and so forth? In terms of scale, are we talking about world-leading universities at the peak of global hierarchies of higher education? In other words, not tied to particular territories or nations, but follow the QS rankings or other rankings and say, these are the leading universities. And then in terms of scale, you're those at the peak of that global hierarchy, or global hierarchies of scientific research, or nodal, marginal, alt, or counter-hegemonic. I used to go many years ago, more years ago than I care to remember, to the Communist University of London. It wasn't a university any more than Trump University is a university, but it was very alt, or in those days we wouldn't call it alt, we would call it counter-hegemonic, trying to challenge the dominant forms, the hegemonic curricula, and so forth. And you could be the world-leading counter-hegemonic Communist University of X, and so forth. And in terms of network, we can think of globally networked higher education institutions, globally connected, coordinating systems of scientific research. And with Brexit, we're about to lose some of our networked aspects of university teaching and research. If we think in terms of global, this is just a quick picture extrapolating the economic center of gravity. So we might have thought that the center of the world was the North Atlantic, from Holland via England to Germany and then the United States, but now it's shifting in the other direction. One of the biggest global challenges in terms of what does globalization mean, what's the global higher education system, is the increasing role of China, both influencing rankings and in terms of trying to reorganize and think about education systems. It's about time, too, when the interesting globalization emerged, it was both global in terms of spatial and temporal. Tony Giddens talked about time-space distanciation. The geographer David Harvey talks about time-space compression. If you think about time-space compression, you can think about how universities are being transformed in terms of casualization, precarization, pressures to publish increasingly, increasing stress that comes from the temporalities, not from the fact that Lancaster may or may not be globally significant, but because the temporalities, the rhythms of our work have changed as a result of globalization or processes that contribute to it. And the other thing I think we need to emphasize in relation to globalization, it's not a done deal. This is back to the alibi aspect. Globalization, which is far broader than neoliberalism, has general frictional limits, even with information communication technologies and so forth. You still need to coordinate time scales. I was editing a book, the geographers will know, State Space, with people in 3 continents, and we had different sleeping patterns so that we could work in real time. But most people don't do that. They're not mad enough to do that. But even with ICTs, you don't communicate 24/7. There are different national traditions and patterns of work. So there are also structural limits, the limits to global governance. I defy anybody to say that higher education or scientific research are globally governed in a coherent and coordinated way. There are competing governance projects for higher education, for scientific research, and so forth. There are environmental limits. Globalization also provokes resistance. The Communist University of London from 1967, but other alt or hegemonic projects, alternative projects, and the global has also adapted and so forth. Now, back to higher education. We think about university, it was already always global. The original universities were Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarum, communities of teachers and scholars with a global language, Latin, so that you could study in many different places. Nylingsom and I were in Lund University, one of the older universities in Sweden, and the students were organized in terms of nations. Instead of colleges, they were organized in terms of nations. Actually, it meant, did you come from this region or that region of Sweden? But the university system was, in earlier days, global, at least in a European Greco-Hellenic tradition. It shifted to the Arabic world, which preserved the Greek traditions. It's being reinvented continually. Actually, the rise of the national education system is relatively late, post-Westphalian, and now it's being reversed. The temporalities may be different, but we shouldn't assume that globalization is something completely new under the sun. It went national, and it's becoming global again. Just to give you an illustration, Hegel, world-famous philosopher, said, I want philosophy to speak German. So instead of writing in Latin, he started writing in German because he wanted to build German nationalism. So we have to read Hegel in German or English translation rather than in Latin. Relatively new innovation. And now we're seeing English as the lingua franca of the global higher education system, being resisted in many places in terms of other traditions. The other point I want to make is once we talk about the university, are we talking about a university as organizations, or are we talking about a system? And I think we would get very different views about what it means to talk about global higher education if we were talking about a global university or about the global integration of higher education and research, where non-global universities, regional universities, local universities, or non-global research, scientific research, could nonetheless contribute to the development and the dynamic of global higher education ecology or a global scientific ecology. When we talk about global universities or global higher education, do we mean the universities are being disembedded from national or local or regional contexts? And if so, are they then being re-embedded into something that exists in some sort of global space? And that, I think, is one of the ambiguities in the notion of global higher education. Is there somewhere up there in the sky a global higher education system that doesn't have local, regional, national roots, that isn't embedded in national, regional, local institutions, or is something else happening? And Polanyi is quite interesting here. I think we can say that universities have been disembedded from traditional institutions. The modernization of the university doesn't at all follow. It's not being re-embedded in something else. And it might be, if Eva Hartman were here, she'd be talking about at least Europeanization, if not globalization, of the standards that govern teaching, of the standards that govern scientific research, and so forth. But precisely that tension between embedding and disembedding creates a whole series of problems for the governance of institutions, in particular two kinds of pressure related to embedding and disembedding. And that's what's the code and program that govern education, credentialization, what's the code and program that govern scientific research. And Niklas Luhmann, you see, this chance encounter has benefits, said that we know that the education system is functioning as an education system or a science as a science system when you choose who to teach or you choose what to research in terms of those codes. You're allowed secondary codes. So let's take not Karl Polanyi, but Michael Polanyi, who believed that science was about scientifically interesting problems. So if you've got two scientifically interesting problems and one brings more cash in than the other to do that research, choosing one of the two equally importantly scientific projects in terms of the cash it brings in, science remains the primary code, economics is the secondary code. But if you choose scientific projects in terms of how much cash they bring in and not in terms of their scientific prominence, you know the university has been captured in terms of its scientific projects by an economic logic. If it were to do, how do we build an atomic bomb in order to win the Second World War, the primary code becomes military security rather than science. And one of the big sources of pressure on disembedded universities to re-embed them within another system in terms of the economic, the state, the military, the environmental, or some other code. The other big pressure, and we've seen it already discussed today, is between inclusion and exclusion, and whether or not universities are meant to be inclusive and how that might transform educational or scientific projects. Now, the Luhmannian perspective, he would say we're already global in the sense that increasingly our horizons of calculation and action are global. So you don't need to be globally present for the global to have an impact. We monitor our competitors around the world, but Lancaster University is still based in Lancaster as far as I'm aware, although it seems to be it's moving around a bit as well. So global doesn't mean globally present, it means taking the globe as a horizon of action, horizon of calculation. And we can see then the development of education and science as global systems of credentialization, scientific production, which may be more or less segmented on national and regional lines. We heard this morning The natural sciences are more global than arts, humanities, social sciences, which are much more nationally or regionally or locally segmented. And so it might be that we want to distinguish with the segmentation and globalization axis of higher education and a center-periphery dimension to the globalization of science, the world-leading scientific centers, and then the peripheral relations as well. Now, how many more minutes do I have if you're the timekeeper?
15.
Sorry?
About 15.
Oh, that's fine. In that case, I'm on schedule to finish without too much time-space compression of the presentation. So I'm now going to deal with the treadmill of competition, taking Luhmann's notion of the recoding of higher education and science, questioning to the extent to which the primary code of education, credentialization, and the primary code of science, which is conforming to prevailing scientific norms, depending on discipline or indeed moving those norms forward, are being undermined by extra educational, extra scientific pressures. So I'm going to take, and we heard this morning a little bit about the knowledge-based economy, defined by the OECD in 1996 as OECD economies are increasingly based on production, distribution, and the use of knowledge and information. Knowledge is now recognized as the driver of productivity and economic growth, leading to a new focus on the role of information technology and learning. The term KBE stems from this fuller recognition of the place and technology in modern OECD economies. A quick aside on discourse. Before the knowledge-based economy, or the information economy, particularly influenced by Japan, we had the information society and the knowledge society. And people working on education have noted the shift from the knowledge society, the information society, to the knowledge economy and the information economy, which might tell you something about the shifting codes, the ways in which we're moving away from the idea of the general intellect or the commons to the private appropriation of traditional knowledge, scientific knowledge, etc., etc. What does that mean? It's an opportunity that's been seized more or less with open arms by universities, as indeed it has by lawyers who want to think about intellectual property, or local government officials who want electronic town halls, or as when Niling and I were in Singapore, we discovered their discourse. They have the most advanced knowledge-based military in the world, using the best advanced technologies. But universities jumped on the knowledge-based economy bandwagon as well, because they were now key drivers of the knowledge-based economy. And what that does is to intensify pressures on firms, what we could also say HEIs, regions or production systems, or HE and scientific networks, to stay ahead of competitors in order to continue to win super profits or super reputations of one kind or another, and prompting efforts to protect monopolies in information or knowledge, or maintain one's position at the top of the global hierarchy in terms of scales, or one's centrality in terms of a national education system, and so forth. And it creates pressures as well to commodify research, but with all of the tensions we know about intellectual commons and anti-commons as well. What it means is, as the KB imaginary spreads globally and the world market becomes more integrated, higher education is constructed as a crucial object of national competitiveness. What's Lancaster's strategic mission? Number 1 in the Northwest, number 10 in the UK within. Number 8 would be very nice, 6 would be even better, and number 100 in the world. And we're continually benchmarking ourselves against our comparators. What are they doing right? What are we doing wrong? And so forth. It's a major source of transformation of the global higher education and education system. And we create quasi-markets, market proxies. We have people like QS telling us whether how we're moving and so forth, is what Nyling Sum calls the paper panopticon, the continual use and manipulation of rankings to put pressure on us all to work a great deal harder. Leads then to two different notions depending where you're located in the world, the competition state and the developmental state. Competition states, in other words, any state concerned with its economic competitiveness, takes increasingly the role of higher education and higher education, scientific research, absolutely crucial factor of competitiveness. Developmental states are trying to engage in catch-up competitiveness, and the horizon of catch-up changes. It used to be, can we become mass industrial manufacturers? Now, if I go to Korea or Taiwan or Singapore or Hong Kong, increasingly China, I see they want to be at the cutting edge, not of mass industry, but in terms of either finance or the creative economy. Korea was the first national economy to have its own ministry for the knowledge-based economy as part of its catch-up competitive strategy. And in fact, Europe in some ways is lagging when in the Lisbon agenda it says we want to become the most competitive knowledge-based economy in the world, compatible with maintaining the European social model and overcoming the democratic deficit, whatever happened to that. And they added a year later and overcoming the environmental crisis. But knowledge-based economy becomes a discourse as a source of pressure, as a source of pressure to integrate globally and to continually trying to be catching up with our competitors. Now, if we look at the ideas of competitiveness, this comes in part from Michael Porter from Harvard. Nyling calls him a knowledge brand and not just a management researcher. We have three modes of competitiveness: factor-driven, innovation-driven, factor-driven, efficiency-driven, and innovation-driven. For early development, primary education is emphasized. I was talking with somebody over lunch about how the World Bank for a time prioritized primary education. Now it's decided actually higher education matters too. In terms of the mid-type of competitiveness, higher education and training becomes crucial. And in innovation-driven economies, Schumpeterian innovation becomes crucial. But education increasingly integrated as a factor of competitiveness. That's catch-up competitiveness. This comes from the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Reports. It's repeated. The most recent one came out this year. And if you look at the factors, and this comes from Nyling's research, we co-authored a book on cultural political economy where Nyling has a chapter on global competitiveness indexes and HE, and the global panopticon, paper panopticon idea, but in the competitiveness index, higher education and training, pillar 5, is one of the selected factors of efficiency enhancing. So we can see, if you like, in my terms, that in terms of credentialization and in terms of scientific research, the primary code is increasingly becoming, and how do you contribute to the economy? What does economization mean? I've written a paper on this in Higher Education out this year, and I'm not going to go into details because Roger needs his space as well, but I think one of the most interesting things that's happening in higher education at the moment, small signs occurring. I heard somebody talk about student loans this morning. We all know about subprime mortgages. One of the increasing factors driving universities and how they operate is real estate-backed loans in universities, and even more so-called SLABs, student loan asset-based securities. You may know that apart from mortgages, the biggest amount of debt in the United States at the moment is student debt, a debt you can't walk away from. The government is privatizing the National Student Loan Scheme here, and that becomes a major factor putting pressure on universities. Increasingly, universities are not given money to invest. They're invited to go to the market and raise bonds. In fact, when I came to Lancaster, we had a bond under the Business Enterprise Scheme, and staff were encouraged to contribute to it. But increasingly, universities are evaluated in terms of their liquidity, which means not how wonderful is your infrastructure, but could we privatize student accommodation? And what's the value of your student accommodation? Could we privatize your student sports center and turn it over to the local community? Because teaching facilities are not worth very much other than for teaching, but real estate could be quite valuable. What we're seeing, in fact, is the financialization and not merely the economic globalization of universities. More on that, as I said in my paper. Entrepreneurship, we're all encouraged to be entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurship in universities has been around for years, but it's increasingly driven by economic criteria. So introduce a new or enhanced programs in higher education, new teaching and research methods, new markets, validating degrees, widening recruitment bases, new funding sources, reorganize education and research by investing in world-class universities. So entrepreneurship now becomes a dominant discourse inside the university, but not how can we innovate to be better teachers, how can we innovate to do better science, but how can we innovate in order to increase the returns, the revenues to universities. Neoliberalism, that's not the same as globalization, but neoliberalism is an important part of the dominant form of globalization today. And I want just to talk about the irrationalities of neoliberalism. We now live in a nation, this is the United States, where doctors destroy health, lawyers destroy justice. James Falconbridge was talking about that. Global law firms are now profit-generating, not other than pro bono organizations. Governments destroy freedom, the press destroys information, religion destroys morals, banks destroy the economy, and universities destroy knowledge. We'll move on from that quickly. Advanced liberalism, which is another form of way of thinking about neoliberalism, the Anglo-Foucauldian school, looking at the practices of advanced liberalism, diverse forms of freedom and action as instruments dedicated to surveillance. And if we think about the monitoring of universities, this is advanced liberalism, but in the name of neoliberal objectives. Again, I could say more about that, and in the PowerPoints there are. I just now want to finally move to varieties of capitalism. We have varieties of educational systems. We have the global system. My own work on varieties of capitalism denies there is a world system with a pre-given logic, but it also says we can't look at varieties of capitalism as if national capitalisms exist in isolation from each other. If we look at the global system today, some people say the largest economy in the world is Chimerica, China plus America, engaged in pathological interdependence, a bit like pathological dependence in families. China needs America, America needs China, and the longer they stay together, the worse things get for both of them. But actually, the largest economy in the world is the transatlantic economy, European Union and North America. Nobody would say the varieties of capitalism, southern Greece, Germany, the United States and so forth are identical, but it functions in terms of the complementarities as well as the contradictions. And I want to suggest we can understand the global higher education system not in terms of varieties of national HE or national science, nor in terms of an already fully integrated global system, but the complementarities and tensions between different university systems, different forms of science. The United States has world-class universities, but is impoverished in terms of STEM subjects. It's parasitic upon university systems that have not yet gone neoliberal. So they're importing from Korea, they're importing from China, they're importing from India, because they invest in rather different priorities in the education system, and we can talk then about imperialism. The gap in STEM subjects in the United States is filled by well-trained international graduate students and skilled immigrants from India, China, Korea, and Singapore, the last two of which rank top in maths and science. If you want to think about global education, you have to think in terms of variegation, not in terms of convergence or standardization. Let's forget that. Let's get to the conclusions. So what I'm suggesting, among other things, again, I can see some things with this perspective I couldn't see from this perspective too, that we can think about globalization and higher education in terms of the recomposition of higher education and research to serve the knowledge-based economy, which includes many different things. That project's been weakened by the crisis in finance-led accumulation, especially in the Anglo-American neoliberal economies where education is under bigger threat than it would be in somewhere like Germany or India, Korea, Japan, and so forth. That recomposition is guided by advanced liberalism, all of those forms of surveillance that we know about, and it's further driven by neoliberalism, which is a counterproductive project because it turns knowledge into intellectual property, when the university system in the past has always thrived on promoting the intellectual commons and sharing knowledge. We heard about open publication. And that's the alternative, the knowledge-based society, not the knowledge-based economy. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Okay, Roger.
Thanks.
To you.
First of all, apologies from Susan that she can't be here. Second of all, apologies from me for not being able to do her justice, I'm sure. But third, some considerable pleasure at being here, where I wouldn't otherwise have been, and enjoyed everything that's going on. In fact, this is I think I can't remember if it's the second or third time that I've been called in this kind of emergency manner to do something like this, and I can't remember. No, it wasn't the first time, but I know the thing that set me up and made me think this is possible, and that was a conversation I had many years ago with Shelley Halsey, the UK sociologist of education, who had just done the set of Reith lectures. And if you know, the Reith lectures is a sort of the highest popular intellectual form of academic work possible in the UK. And more than this, Shelley told me he'd been called in late because somebody had dropped out. So I thought, wow. I said, how do you do that, Shelley? He said, any academic worth his salt has got a set of Reith lectures hanging around somewhere. And so here you are. This is my substitute for a Reith lecture. I want to start off, I'll try and hurry through this, but following on from this morning, one thing I think that really, one set of questions that are begged is, what do business and universities need from each other? And what do governments and students need from each other? And with what outcomes and what outputs are these arrangements constructed? Who needs universities and for what? What do universities offer to whom? I've got a quote here from, this gives an idea of the strength of the university, because I think that this morning we got the impression, quite rightly, because that was the focus, that there is the central nexus is the relationship between the institutions of higher education and the institutions of commerce who interact with them in various ways. But the universities do have some lives, I think, outside this, and they do bring a lot to the table, and I think we need to recognize what it is that universities still do bring uniquely to the table. So here's a quote from Derek Bock, former, I think, president of Harvard. "We don't often stop to think what an exceptional position universities have come to occupy. Our universities are now the leading sources of all three of the most important ingredients for progress and prosperity in modern societies: new discoveries, expert knowledge, and highly trained people." Now, you could get all those things separately, and we do get those things separately. But there is an argument that in a sense, their co-presence within an institution has very positive multiplier effects. That it is because it does these things, that the university as an institution and the university as organizations are not totally confined to one of these particular areas. I want, though, to start, and I must apologize for having no PowerPoints. The thing that does PowerPoints on my computer has eaten all of them, and I can't create any new ones. So where I thought I'd start talking a little bit here about a different way of talking about the university. A couple of weeks or so ago, I wrote a short piece for a Portuguese educational journal about the idea of global citizenship education, which seems to have been receiving quite a lot of attention in some academic work recently. Now, we can see where the idea of global citizenship education comes from. Because beyond its dominant claims, I mean, and not just higher education, beyond its dominant claims to drive economic growth, education often also appears to be seen as a kind of panacea for all kinds of social ills, such as teenage pregnancy, drug taking, gang violence, etc. Importantly, however, these do point the recognition that this is part of education, that this points to the fundamentally meliorist, and I think it is still the case, the meliorist nature of the mission that at least Western universities are expected to carry out for society, alongside their contribution to the formation of workers and, more narrowly, citizens. What I wanted to argue in this paper, and what I did argue in this paper, was that in terms of both substance and style, the idea of a global citizenship education was essentially a nonsense and was inevitably likely to fail. And this is because it is very interesting, difficult to discern what would be the population covered by this, what would be the populations if we're talking in terms of global citizenship, comprised as the highest common denominator, lowest common factor of national citizenship educations. But I wanted to go further than that and say that the claim that there could be a global citizenship education at the same time, and its inevitable failure, at the same time enabled a malign consequence of the argument. It enabled the generation and occupation of spaces for populist responses to the area of civil society. The key argument was that the domination of the economic frames the form of the political and that the combination of the all-powerful economy combined with the politics that it shapes, and which I will argue is to a considerable degree gestural or symbolic, it's a symbolic response in the space occupied by the forms of civil society. That one perverse consequence of the idea of global citizenship education is to create the space and to reinforce the space for populism, because it is in terms of citizenship education that we can see not just the seeds, but the flowerings of populism developing most rapidly. It is when populism is put on one side of a global citizenship divide. And that global citizenship divide, the content and the divide it creates, is of course constructed by what is construed from the point of view of populism as the elite. It is construed by them. And more widely, we can see that this idea of salvation through who were you talking about? Who's going to save us? Keynesianism. Yeah. Anyway, that this is to be achieved through combinations of formal education and formal sets of citizenship is very powerful fodder for a populist cause. The idea that global higher education makes things equal for everyone, which is part of its claim, it seems to me, is a seriously misleading and dangerously misleading one. So the argument about citizenship education is that the nature, purposes, and ineffectiveness of its stated outcomes, but not the political space it fills, can be explained by the elite and elitist assumptions of policymakers in the area, who all, in one way or another, intentionally or unintentionally, wittingly or unwittingly, seek to, perhaps, impose particular understandings of how the society as a whole works and how it can be made to work better for the benefit of everyone, which are more continuous with the assumptions and understandings and practices of the various texts that promote citizenship education than we others. And that one key consequence of this is to create socio-political spaces that can promote dissent and disruption. Globalization, then, can be seen, in this case, globalization can be seen as almost a fracture line across most societies, with the global on one side and the local on the other side, and the assumption that the global will somehow provide an escalator for the local to catch up. And I think this is a very dangerous kind of conception of the taken for granted benefits and goodness of global citizenship education. So my conclusion was that such efforts were not only mistaken, but dangerously misleading. While the idea of a common global civil society on which some claims necessarily rested was superficially attractive, it seems distinctly myopic to say the least. What common elements could be found across all the people of Europe, let alone the rest of the world, between all regions and all religions and none, for instance? There is clearly a need for global peace, but equally its achievement is well beyond any contemporary possibilities. The main danger, it seems, was that far from extending and embedding a global citizenship, such efforts were much more likely to add further to the populist bonfires that have become such a significant element of contemporary political life. Populism essentially sees societies as split into antagonistic groups, broadly the pure people and the corrupt elite, and it advocates for a politics that prioritizes the will of the people. What I saw when I looked at the many proposals for global citizenship education was essentially a set of very well-meaning projects that were more likely to stimulate and extend populism because inevitably they were the product of a newly self-identified elite from which the rest remained excluded. This then led me to wonder about, how long do I have?
10 more minutes.
Okay, that's plenty. About the status and provenance of a global higher education policy. While there are many arguments about how it works, what it entails, and so on, these exist not least because it seems to be both elite and plural. So the wider question I want to address is, what, if anything, is it that enables the global higher education policy to make the kinds of prescriptions and proposals that it advances without opening doors to populism? This is a difficult and dangerous venture. There's a very nice kind of chronology set up by Ralph Dahrendorf in 1990, reflecting upon the nature of post-communist transformations. He said, it'll take 6 months for the institutions of parliamentary democracy, 6 years for the market economy, and 6 decades for civil society. And what we have is an institution of the university that aims to, as Derek Bock says, that aims to contribute in all those areas. But we recognize that it can't, and that some of its responses are counterproductive. I'll just cut out the next piece. So I want then to suggest that there's something more than the rules and institutions that hold elites together, that the core of the global higher education policy may not rest not so much in its institutions, certainly not those institutions and rules at all, but in the underlying philosophy and understanding of what counts as knowledge that holds them together, and that institutions and rules may only work because they rest on these at a deeper basis. I want to make one more point when I can find it, and that is that to suggest that there is a basis to the university's claims to be the guardian of specific kinds of knowledge, and that those claims inhere in its in a sense its philosophy of practice. And that philosophy of practice is one, see if I can find the phrases. There's something more than the rules and institutions holding these elites together, that the core of the global higher education policy may rest not so much in its institutions, certainly not those institutions and rules alone, but in the underlying philosophy, the understanding of what counts as knowledge that holds them together, and that the institutions and rules only work because they rest on this deeper basis. One somewhat old-fashioned way of putting this is that the distinctive features of what enables the study of higher education and the expectations of its practitioners, which amount to a distinct set of expectations that, albeit implicitly, acts as brakes on academic excess. What makes it work and what makes it trusted, irrespective of the field of activity, is the philosophy within that underlies the idea of the university, I think, and its adherence. This develops mutatis mutandis from the very old-fashioned norms of Robert K. Merton, the norms of scientific disinterestedness and organized skepticism, though I'm not sure that the norm of nominalism has been equally fully served. So all these are a very long way from the claims for a global citizenship education. Why do they believe our claims? Why should they? The argument I want to advance is that the key medium of the global higher education policy and moral economy of what I will refer to unsatisfactorily as a particular case of cast of mind, a skepticism, a requirement to have truth demonstrated rather than asserted, is transnational, held in various ways at national and transnational levels. Its essence is a style of thought that embeds and embodies and characterizes the claims of higher education and universities to have a common global reach and to be themselves evidence of the possibility of working on behalf of all mankind. No country owns or monopolizes the idea of the university. It abides in a context embedded in a critical a-national discourse. The central assumption is the political indifference of knowledge. It is based on conditions of truth and proof. The university challenges objectively the claims that it makes. It overrides other claims because it disseminates not just local but more global facts, though it does not prevent their elimination. And I'm not talking here about fake truths. This philosophy is so deeply ingrained in academic work as not to need drawing attention to. It's not a global form of a kind of conscience collective precisely because it is exclusive. Craig Calhoun has put this very nicely. Liberals often fail to recognize the social conditions of their own discourse, presenting it as freedom from social belonging rather than a special set of belonging, a view from nowhere and everywhere rather than from particular social spaces. The views of cosmopolitan elites express privilege. They are not neutral apprehensions of the whole. And I think I'll stop there given the time. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to have a short break now. Short break, and then both our speakers will be here for Q&A. Paul will lead that.